I'd like to detour for a moment also and point out that Preston's vision of what he calls socialism avoids the Misesian calculation problem. And that's because his small, cooperatively owned businesses and so forth deal with each other in an overarching market economy in which genuine prices can arise. People still will be able to engage in economic calculation in Preston's ideal world. His local organizations occupy the place of the firm in standard economic theory, although they are firms with unusual and to Preston preferable internal structures. Now I bring up Preston's example because it leads into my next point. There are different versions of what liberty should be and what a libertarian society ought to look like. So is it possible for there to be an overarching framework for liberty that allows the liberty desired by free market libertarians, that's sought by anarcho-socialists such as Preston, and perhaps other visions of liberty as well? I believe that there is, and that's the road I wish to recommend tonight. To avoid the Hobbesian war of all against all, humans form civil associations. A civil association is a group of people united in recognizing the authority of a body of law over all the individuals who comprise the group. And recognizing the authority of a body of law implies the free use of one's intelligence in choosing to recognize it. In other words, one must be persuaded, not coerced, into recognizing the authority of that law over oneself. I believe that for civilized society to exist, the rule of law is essential. But I would like to suggest, as a step down the road to liberty, a single modification to the prevailing view of civil associations, one that I feel is implied by their nature. Now today the main form we have of civil associations is states. But what I'm going to suggest modifies this in a way that perhaps people would not even call what remains a state. I believe that the recognition, the change I recommend is to recognize the right of every person to freely form, join, and leave civil associations on their own choice. I believe that the recognition of such a right would provide a framework for achieving the maximum liberty compatible with human civilization. Therefore, let me explain what I mean by this right. First of all, a person's right to join a civil association would extend only to those associations that would welcome the person. You could not legitimately force your way into a group by violence, fraud, or stealth. On the other hand, no third party, such as a group with which you were previously associated, could prevent you from joining a new group. Only the people already in a civil association and the person seeking to join it can decide the issue. Next, I will point out that if we recognize the right to withdraw from civil associations at will, we have acknowledged the right to secession. The word secession can be a bit frightening. Probably not to this audience, but to some audiences anyway. As it conjures up the image of hundreds of thousands of casualties in the U.S. Civil War and Chechen rebels blowing up buildings. My own belief is that violent secession is rarely a step forward on the way to liberty. And what I'm suggesting is not that people currently begin making plans to violently overthrow their current government, but that people come to demand from their governments the right to exit. Just in the same fashion that, generally speaking, people today demand the right to free speech. I'll also note that seceding to escape punishment for a crime already committed is not what I mean by a right of secession. In other words, I can't kill someone and then announce, oh, and by the way, I secede, so don't bother trying to prosecute me. Presumably the entry agreements into civil associations would prevent that sort of thing. The sharpest contrast to our current world in what I suggest is that people should be able to leave a civil association without leaving a geographical location. Unless they have explicitly agreed to remain part of some civil association, in their purchase or rental agreement for their residence, as, for instance, people often do when purchasing a condo or a home in a planned community. They should have the right to withdraw both themselves and their land from the authority of their current civil association. Having done so, a person might attempt to join another existing civil association, might try to persuade others to form a new one, or might remain outside of any civil association whatsoever. To deny people the right to secession employs aggression rather than persuasion in attempting to constitute a civil association. It violates the essential nature of civil association, which requires the voluntary recognition of the authority of a body of law. Now, it's true that today most people have at least some possibility of leaving the state in which they live. But to do so, they must leave their friends, their families, their jobs, their house, perhaps even their language behind them. They are further hampered by numerous immigration restrictions in other states. Of course, the civil associations I envision are likely to have membership restrictions. But with a vastly greater number of such associations, it is likely that at least a few would accept any particular would-be member. Moreover, the possibility of choosing a truly different form of civil association is slowly being eliminated by the dawning worldwide state system, where the United States and its allies are imposing, by economic pressure, the lure of foreign aid and loans, military force, and so forth, the social democratic model of state corporatism combined with extensive social benefits and high tax rates upon the entire world. Many neoconservative and neoliberal pundits are quite explicit in declaring social democracy the end of history and saying that it should be imposed by force across the world. The United States and its G8 allies may object to countries such as Iraq that allow too little freedom, but they also strongly discourage countries from allowing too much freedom. Countries with tax rates too low are labeled as suspicious tax havens. Those with too much banking privacy are marked as possible supporters of terrorism. The U.S. government is currently telling Canada not to relax its marijuana laws. The IMF forbids member nations from adopting the gold standard as a monetary regime. Prudence Bushnell, the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala, actually used her position to campaign against a university there because it was promoting the radical libertarian ideas of Mises and Hayek. She'd never heard of Rothbard, I guess, and was questioning the need for an income tax, welfare, and public schooling. Now, we don't need to posit any sort of global Masonic conspiracy to explain such facts. For those of you who do posit one, that doesn't mean that there isn't, but we don't need it. We don't need it to explain these facts. Government officials are clever enough to realize that states offering people more freedom than their own are a threat to them, since more libertarian states will tend to draw bright, ambitious, and wealthy people from more restrictive states. Pure self-interest will lead a state to attempt to prevent other states from being significantly less intrusive than it is. In the world-spanning social democracy, we will see Hayek's insight that the worst rise to the top played out on a global scale. The unprecedented concentration of power that would exist would place an enormous prize before the most vicious power addicts. Therefore, the idea of a right to choose one's own form of governance at any geographic scale is perhaps more important than ever as a counterweight to the New World Order. The right I am proposing even leaves those who chafe at any constraints on their behavior other than their own vision of justice with a way out. They may withdraw completely from civil life and become an outlaw. Such people would probably withdraw to remote wilderness areas. They would be living without the protection of any body of law. But so long as they left the members of existing civil associations alone, there is no reason to suppose that they would be pursued or bothered, except perhaps by their outlaws. But the ability to make one's own law in dealing with others by whom one feels wronged is probably the most important motivation such a person has for leaving civil association behind. Since members of different civil associations will still interact with each other in the world I'm envisioning, the question arises as to how conflicts between them can be settled peacefully. In many cases, I believe, civil associations will negotiate agreements with each other for arbitrating disputes between their members. Further, Furthermore, the ability of individuals to agree to a system of law without a central authority to impose one recently has been shown to be much greater than political theory had traditionally imagined it to be. Ed Stringham of San Jose State University has demonstrated that the trading of derivatives on the 17th century Amsterdam stock market proceeded peacefully and without a great deal of fraud, despite the fact that the Dutch government refused to enforce derivative contracts. They basically said that if you are defrauded by someone, and they were very suspicious of short selling and options and so forth, and they said, yeah, if you're defrauded in such a thing, don't come to us. And yet, nevertheless, it has shown that an orderly market in derivatives did exist. Similarly, Peter Leeson of George Mason has cited the Law Merchant Code of the High Middle Ages and Renaissance as another example of voluntary law operating successfully. The widespread recognition of a right to secession certainly does not make war between civil associations impossible, but I believe it renders it significantly less likely, since any civil association promoting a war that is even mildly unpopular will be immediately faced with a wave of secession. Under such a system, states like those we find today, I think, are less likely to exist. Many civil associations will have features of current states to which libertarians might object, such as welfare programs, drug laws, draft laws, and so on. But if the members of those civil associations have the opportunity to exit, and they have not done so, then it's clear that they're persuaded that they wish to live under such a system of law. If they're in such a civil association voluntarily, then I don't perceive aggression being committed against them by, for instance, laws on the part of their civil association banning drug usage or something of the sort. Of course, my idea does not guarantee that no oppressive state could emerge, but I don't believe it is reasonable to expect guarantees in life. The widespread acceptance of the belief that human slavery is immoral has not prevented some people from occasionally capturing other people and enslaving them. But one must admit that the practice is somewhat less prevalent today than it was in 1750. Similarly, if a right to secession gains widespread moral approval, then it seems likely that it will be much more difficult to organize an oppressive state. My friend Paul Birch expressed a possible problem with my idea. He doubted the practicality of geographically intermingled civil associations. As he put it, unless civil associations of which persons are voluntary members are territorially distinct and not too small, people cannot avoid being subject to laws to which they have not acceded, because disputes will commonly arise between members of different associations who have different laws. I believe that deriving authoritative law for interactions between members of different civil associations through negotiation between the groups goes some way toward handling his objection, as do the cases of voluntary law I've mentioned. As one piece of evidence, I'm going to mention a novel, Neil Stephenson's excellent novel, The Diamond Age. Stevenson describes a world that is basically without states as we know them. People have formed geographically intermingled groups based on the code of ethics to which they subscribe. There is, for instance, a group called the Vickies who subscribe to Victorian ethics. People join or leave these groups by their own choice, and the groups commercially interact with each other every day. Now, I admit that a fictional world like that is not as convincing a bit of evidence as an actually operating society with that feature, but the fact that Stevenson is able to construct a coherent and plausible world, I think, lends credence to the idea that this is not inherently ridiculous in any sense. An important feature of the road to liberty I'm suggesting is that the possibility of the real world coming to resemble the vision depends almost exclusively on the widespread acceptance of the idea that membership in the civil association should be voluntary. Such an idea is already held, albeit incoherently and inconsistently, by many people today. We can hear it expressed in calls for self-governance and democracy. Rather than attempt to convince a majority of people to adopt an entirely new ethical or political system, we only need to draw their attention to the fact that there is a conflict within their current one. While most people believe in the right to self-government, their failure to recognize a universal right to secede significantly vitiates that right.